Mongoose, an object data modeling library designed for MongoDB and Node.js. Why you should learn it is simple. 1. It makes working with MongoDB a whole lot easier, and 2. Because of its popularity, they literally named an animal after it. But you might go ahead and say, why oh why should I learn it? I mean, I already started integrating plain old MongoDB inside of my applications after learning it from you from your last upload 6 months ago, and I'll be like, yeah, you're right, but to be honest, Mongoose comes with a lot more features that MongoDB just doesn't come with out of the box, such as things like models, schemas, and middleware. And no, I am not talking about Express middleware from that 7-month-old video that I stopped uploading. All of which are topics which we are going to discuss in this video for you to become a MongoDB/Mongoose expert. So to get started, I'm assuming you have MongoDB installed, and if you don't, go ahead and watch my MongoDB video, and I'm also assuming you have Node.js installed, and if you don't, I'm confused to why you are here, so go ahead and watch my Node.js videos. Now I'm going to start off with a clean project and run npm install mongoose, and I'm also going to run npm install --save-dev to save this as a dev dependency nodemon. Now inside of my index.js file, I'm going to go ahead and connect my Mongoose app to my MongoDB database, so I'm going to require Mongoose and then type in mongoose.connect. This will allow me to connect the app to the database. Then from there, I'm just going to write in MongoDB, then provide my localhost IP address, and then / the name of my database, which in my case is just Mongoose. But you could go ahead and name it whatever you like. Now, unlike MongoDB, where after I connect my Node app, I could just start adding any kind of documents, and these documents would just be structured willy-nilly, in Mongoose, it's a little bit more restrictive. And by little, I mean a lot more restrictive. Mongoose is kind of like a mom that will not allow you to play with your friends because you're her youngest son. Now, the way Mongoose will restrict the incoming data is first you will need to have a schema, and from that schema you would have to create a model. Now, what is a schema? What is a model? You're just throwing around a bunch of buzzwords. I'm out of here. Hold your horses, I will explain that. A schema is nothing more than a blueprint, and the incoming data must resemble this blueprint. Now, a model is essentially a class derived from the blueprint. If you're familiar with object-oriented programming, you might create a class and from that class an object. And if you're familiar with SQL databases, you could have just skipped that whole explanation and skipped me sounding like an angry child. But now we're going to get into the juicy stuff, so sorry for wasting your time. Now, most commonly when people have databases, they use it to store their users' information. So if you remember what I was ranting on about 15 seconds ago, the first thing we'll need to do is create a schema. So I'm going to go ahead and create a constant, and guess what I'm going to call it? User schema. Then I'm going to set that equal to new mongoose.schema. The schema in the .schema will have a capital S, and also it will be a method that accepts an object. This object will be the blueprint of the document. Now, normally when people create accounts for online services, they provide things like their name and their email address, and maybe even something like their age. So for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and set name and email to strings with capital S's, by the way, and I'll also set age to number with capital N, by the way. And congratulations, you've just created your very first schema, unless you've been using SQL before. Now, what's left to do is create a model for our schema. So I'm going to go ahead and create a constant called user with a capital U and set that equal to mongoose.model, and the first argument inside of the model will be the name of our model, which is user, and the second argument would be the user schema itself. And congratulations, you've now created yourself a model. I gotta stop congratulating people after writing one line of code. Now what we want to do is mimic receiving information from a user and adding it to the database. So we're going to create a document inside of a user collection inside of our MongoDB database. So what we're going to do is create a constant called user with a lowercase u. This will be the actual user, and we'll set that equal to new user with the capital U, referring to the model that I have just created. And this will contain the information about the user. Now, this information will be an object with a name value, an email value, and an age value. And on a side note, normally this object will be a request body that we receive from an Express server, but I don't want to overcomplicate anything, but perhaps I'll integrate Mongoose with an Express server in a future video. And on another side note, I set the name equal to Johnny because I found that name on a baby names website and it has nothing to do with Johnny Depp, the actor. Now there's one last thing we actually need to do, and I promise this is the last thing to do in order to add a document into the database, and that pretty much is to save the document by using the user.save method. Now the user.save method is asynchronous, so you have to add await to it. And if you're using something like TypeScript, then you could just go ahead and use top level await, but we're using plain old JavaScript, so for that reason I have to take this await user.save and put it inside of an asynchronous function and call the asynchronous function. And now at this point, if I go ahead and run my database and also run node-mon-index.js, I'd be able to view that I have a users collection with a user document with the name of Johnny inside of robo3t. Now here's the thing, all of this code at first glance looks perfectly fine, but there's a lot more to Mongoose than just this. There's a lot more into creating schemas, models. We're also going to be taking a look at methods in this video, and there isn't just enough space to put all of that junk in one file and call it index.js. So I'm just going to go ahead and restructure my code a little, and as you can see over here, I have a source directory with an index.js file, a db folder, and a models folder. Inside of my db folder, I have a mongoose/config file, and there I'm just connecting Mongoose to my MongoDB database. Then inside of the user file that is located inside of models, I'm requiring Mongoose as a constant, and I'm setting up its schema, and then I'm just exporting it out of my user file. Then inside of my index.js file, I'm requiring mongoose/config, and also requiring my user model, and setting it equal to a user constant. Then I'm just creating a user from the model and saving it into the database. Now if I go ahead and run source/index.js, I should find two documents inside of my database. And now that we've structured our files and folders correctly, we can now focus on our first obstacle, and that is understanding schemas. Now if you just take a look at our user schema, there isn't really much that I'm doing with it, aside from setting name and email to a string and also setting age to a number. So in order to add more restrictions, instead of setting name equal to directly a string, we can set it equal to an object. Now if we do set it to an object, we can give it a property of type and set that equal to a string, and that would be the equivalent of having name equal to string directly. But we want to give it more restrictions. Now one of the most important rules we can provide is the required property. Now the required property does exactly what it says on the tin, and that is making the name field required, and if I do not provide it, it will throw an error. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing to the email field, but I'm also going to provide another property, and that is unique. Now unique again does exactly what it says on the tin. It makes sure that that field remains unique. I mean, think about it, how many times did you try to log into a website and find that you already have an account and now you have to go ahead and do forget password? Unique will do the exact same thing. It does not allow two documents inside the same collection to have the same values. Now I'm also going to provide a lowercase property, and essentially that's just going to go ahead and convert my email to lowercase because emails are not case sensitive, so we want to just make sure that everything remains a lowercase. We can also use an uppercase property, but it just doesn't make any sense to have an uppercase and lowercase property on the same field. Now there's also another property which is default, and that applies to any fields that are not required. And essentially this is just going to go ahead and provide a default value. I'll just go ahead and keep it on age with 0. Now there's one last property that I want to show you, and that is immutable. Now immutable is the only property that doesn't say exactly what it does on the tin unless you know the meaning of immutable, and that pretty much means you will not be able to update it later on. This is very useful when it comes to created at timestamps, because if you do have it created at timestamp, you don't want somebody to go ahead and update it later on, because I mean, for crying out loud, it's the created at timestamp. But to be honest, I don't like creating my own timestamps in Mongoose, because Mongoose will go ahead and provide that for you if you just go ahead and add inside of your schema as a second object the timestamp property and set that equal to true. Now if you go ahead and save it, you will also find a timestamp of created at and updated at inside of your document. Now, I gotta admit that I did say that the last property I'm gonna show is immutable, but there is one last property that I need to show you, and that is not entirely a property. It was a little white lie I just made up, and it is actually a function called validate. Now, validate allows you to write your own JavaScript inside of it, so you can go ahead and customize the property however you want. It's essentially a customizable property. Now, I'm just gonna test out this validate function on my number field and just provide it with an if statement and check if the value is less than 0. Then in that case, I want to throw an error and say something like age cannot be negative. And just to show you the power of using validate, I'm going to install an npm package called validator. Not to confuse it with validate, this is a package that comes with a bunch of methods such as isAlpha and isEmail, and you'll be able to go ahead and test if a string is an email and if it contains letters or special characters and so on. So I'm going to go to my email field and use validate and check if validator.isEmail, then in that case throw an error and say must be email. And likewise, I'm going to do the exact same thing to my name property and check validator.isAlpha, and if the string that is provided is not just containing alphabet, then in that case throw an error and say name must contain letters. Now, there is one thing I would like to show you inside of the schemas, and that is how to create an array inside of your schema. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a field called tokens and set that equal to an array. Now, I would like this array to be an array of objects, so therefore I'm going to open and close an object and give it a property of token, and this token would have its values such as a type of string, and required I'll set that equal to true. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of this, but what I want to show you is this is how you would go ahead and implement JSON Web Tokens inside of Mongoose. If you are unfamiliar with JSON Web Tokens, it is essentially a way for you to be authenticated every time you make a request to your server, rather than sending your email and password every time you want to make a change on the database. Now, if you want to learn more about JSON Web Tokens, I'll be covering that in a future video for my Node.js course. However, in the next video, we'll be covering part 2 of Mongoose: queries, methods, and middleware. And on that bombshell, we're done for this video, so don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you liked it, and thanks for watching.